I was kind of also hoping to go over like some of the Old Testament prophets. Just like I was kind of curious on what some of their practices were. Like for example, Elijah. What did his alchemy practice look like? I'm assuming he had one.
It had to do with the repetition of certain mantras, the utilization of the voice, the utilization of sound, the utilization of certain physical props, different types of prayer beads, similar to the types of rosaries that you can see in Western religion, similar to the types of beads and prayer beads that can be seen in Eastern religion. The utilization of this was also a part of the practice. The, you could say, offering of energy and substance, the art of ritual was also utilized. The art of and practice of astrology and astronomy were also utilized in this being's process.
Where was he? So are those practices more from it's just a mix, or did he have a specific, is it more like from India or more from Egypt kind of thing?
These were practices that were passed throughout his lineage. So within the lineage, there are certain occult and esoteric groups that oftentimes are not named, but will exist and will train a certain amount of people within the society in these types of practices that involve mysticism, spirituality, and in some instances, occult ritual. So Elijah was a part of this particular, you could say, lineage that produced most of the prophets. Many of them were connected to this lineage. It still exists to this day, although it went through a certain degree of fracturing throughout time, throughout history.
Yeah, because like in the Old Testament, there was I think the phrase like the sons of the prophets. To me, that seemed like those would have been like students of whatever.
Yes, there are references to this throughout biblical texts. Absolutely. And the idea of the sons of the prophets as a symbol is an accurate, you could say, representation of the type of energy and perspective that was utilized by these individuals.
Well, in that case, I know like when Elijah passes to the next one's Elisha. The spelling changes slightly, but um, he like gives them the mantle and and all of that. What was the significance in there? Is there actual power stored in that, or
There is power stored in that, yes. So the power exists on multiple levels. So some of the levels are symbolic. There's a symbolic transference of wisdom, of power, of legacy. So that's there. But there are also literal dimensions of power. So when this is passed on, there's a transference of the wisdom, the knowledge, the energy, and the legacy. Both a symbolic and literal transference of power takes place. And there is still power that is retained by those whom are making the offering. They still have power, they still have influence, they still have relevance, of course. But it's like that mantle of responsibility is now making its way to the younger generations, allowing for them to forge those types of relationships and spiritual connections, allowing for them to explore their roles within the society, their roles becoming prophets, becoming people of religious and spiritual influence designed to guide the society in a way that allows for ultimately the Jews and the Israelites to experience greater prosperity, greater relationship with the source, greater alignment with the way, with the Tao, as it sometimes is called.
okay? Um, on some of that stuff, like if John the Baptist was like a reincarnation of Elijah, was he able to kind of like channel Elijah's self and feed, Yeshua information about some of those practices like that?
These types of things would occur. Yes. So many of these prophets and many of these spiritual practitioners would oftentimes spontaneously channel some of these abilities connected to their past lives. Now, they wouldn't always have a conscious knowledge or awareness of where the technique or information would necessarily be coming from, but nevertheless, the method and the information would still be able to reach them, and they would then be able to apply it within their experience.
Okay. And then I was just gonna kind of ask about some of Moses's practices. Um, but like, also on a quick side note is, there's a story where they have the rod and they cast it down, it turns into the snake. Is that just a symbolism of the Kundalini ability of the priests, kind of saying that Moses has had more, or is that an actual rod turning into a snake kind of deal?
So there are practices that involve the transformation of one object into another. These types of things do exist, and this has been performed before. And the idea is that whilst this is an occult practice, a type of magical practice, it is being used in that particular instance as a symbol.
And what specific symbol? Would you be able to expand?
The symbol relates primarily to the returning of the old ways, the returning of old knowledge, the returning of old methodologies back to the earth in exchange for new perspectives, new medicines, new ideas, new creations. So it's a type of transference, a type of commerce, a type of exchange with the planet itself.
I'm kind of lost on how that would work during that. Is that, I mean, because in a way, there's kind of like a new beginning for the people if they're leaving, but like, it kind of seems like they would separate themselves from the Egypt bit of knowledge. I'm trying to understand where the new ways, or the revival of the old ways kind of come in at this.
What is the specific instance you're referring to?
Well, I'm just thinking of like Old Testament where the Moses is supposed to cast down or Aaron might have cast it down for him. The rod turns into a snake, but then the priests do it as well.
For what purpose?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to understand. Like, was that just a literal, trying to show off each other's powers, or could that have had some symbolism of like maybe the rod had to do more with like Kundalini energy? Like, okay, maybe he's got more ability or something. I just never explored that take on it. That's what I was asking.
Sure, it is a reference to Kundalini, yes, and it is also you could say, skill demonstration. Precisely, yes.
On Moses's practices, what did his primary alchemy practices look like?
Primarily breathing exercises that were blended with different types of elemental practices that would rearrange and shift the proportions of the elements, allowing for the elements to create certain types of desired effects within his consciousness and within reality, allowing for him to produce certain types of miracles and phenomenon to his benefit and to the benefit of those around him.
That's like a large contrast kind of to Elijah. He's just solely like basically like breath and awareness to where he's able to start to influence by his awareness.
Yes, precisely. Yes. Is a level of consciousness that was initiated through his close encounters with the source, which you would call the Yahweh. So it allowed for some of these perspectives and ultimately practices that would sustain them to be learned and experienced by him.
Huh. Was there a particular like maybe like an Egyptian deity or school that influenced him? Because it said he was learned in all the ways of, like it seemed like the Egyptian secret arts.
This was a type of, you could say, training and exposure that he had at a later point within his journey. It was through this connection with the source that he ultimately began to explore these other methods and these other ways. These were some of the practices that were learned, as we had mentioned, that allowed for him to sustain the spiritual states that the source exposed him to. So once he had those contact experiences, he then he then received different types of spiritual techniques that would allow for him to sustain those states of consciousness. Synchronicity delivered that to him.
Okay, so that was like very backwards. I guess the one I had in my mind, I was kind of thinking because he had these like special ability or special teachings, then somehow he got up the ladder that way, so to speak. But how so he has the encounter with Yahweh, which is that I thought that was kind of like some of the Anunnaki coming back to assist. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. Keep in mind that Yahweh exists not necessarily as a literal physical being, but exists as a type of energetic egregore, a type of personification of existence itself, expressing as a being. The
How did he
Anunnaki are a different type of consciousness. They are, you could say, under the will, they are under the influence of Yahweh. But keep in mind that Yahweh is not Yahweh in the Sumerian pantheon or pantheonic system. So these are sort of two different systems. You're sort of mixing terms here.
okay. Um so that kind of I guess now that kind of opens up different things in my mind because I'm trying to at first I was thinking, okay, maybe he's an actual like being that was on a mountain and that may have been like a local mountain deity that got, elevated over time. But then, but the way I'm hearing it is kind of like an archetype that was already existing outside of that.
Yes, yes, precisely.
How did the encounter like align up for him? Was it just that he was seeking, or I mean, I'm assuming it's a before birth kind of plan, but on like a physical level, how did he kind of connect into that?
He was specifically aligned with the genetic lineage that would allow for him to naturally have an easier time communing with the source consciousness. It was also a time in his life energetically where certain genetic factors were becoming more active, allowing for those dormant properties to awaken. It was also a time where contact of sorts needed to take place in order for him to be adequately prepared for the challenges and changes that were going to be ahead of him. So these were some of the factors that played a role in the timing. And on a personal level, yes, he very much was a seeker and was desiring this type of contact in a variety of different ways. So these types of things were desired and ultimately were realized through that type of aspiration and devotion for contact and for embodying the qualities that would be needed for sustaining it.
Did some of his I guess like teachings from learning how to sustain that state, did that get passed down like through the tribe of
Yes.
Levi way?
Yes, yes. As we had mentioned, there is a lineage that many of these people are connected to. And the practices, the techniques that are learned, that are received, that are downloaded, these types of things are passed along. They survive, they live on.
So it was all like the tree of life. Is that all part of this particular lineage?
Very much so, yes.
Okay.
There are also multiple versions of the tree of life. Some that are, you could say, more popular, more common. And then there are some that are private that are, you could say, kept by this group and this lineage.
Cool. I mean, are they fairly close or they're not really close at all? Or just like couple extra points, just like in a generic? I'm wondering.
It's more like multiple dimensions and layers are revealed and are included. So more layers and perspectives of the existing structure.